Well, welcome. I'm Mackenzie Warren, a news executive at Gannett, here on location in Boston at the IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference, and I'm here with the executive director of IRE, Mark Horvit. And Mark, I just want to kind of spend the next few minutes assessing the state of watchdog journalism in America and indeed around the world, and some tools that are out there to help people get better. And you're, just to give a little background on you, you've got 21 years as a reporter and editor before your IRE role. So you've been all over the place, and you've seen these things from lots of different angles. So that makes me ask you, our colleague Len Downey just wrote an item in the Washington Post on the 40th anniversary of Watergate, kind of lamenting the state of investigative journalism in his view. And I wondered if you think that investigative journalism is in as bad a way as Len assesses it.
You know, I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. Certainly, investigative reporting has taken the same hit that reporting has taken generally in this country. There are fewer reporters doing everything, right? There's fewer people covering City Hall. There's fewer people in state houses. There are fewer people covering travel, for that matter. And there are fewer people full-time doing investigative journalism. So it's definitely not where it was, 10 years ago. But there's still a lot of great work that's being done at news organizations, large and small, around the country. I think that especially in the last couple of years, too, we've started to see a bit of a resurgence, a bit of a rededication by a lot of news organizations, both individually and at the corporate level, in putting their resources back again towards doing sort of enterprise, watchdog, investigative, call it what you want.
How do you explain that?
I think what we've been preaching all through this, that if you give that up, you're giving up one of the fundamental reasons that people come to you in the first place as a source of news, right? I mean, the one thing which I think some people didn't take into consideration, and it's tough. I mean, when you're having to cut and you're having to save money, you're just doing what you've got to do. But I think a lot of people didn't take into consideration the fact that if they stripped down too much and just gave basic stories about what was happening, that's the kind of thing you can get lots of places on the web. There's plenty of competition for that, and if that's what you reduce your news organization to, then there really isn't any reason for people to keep coming back. So I think what people knew all along and just didn't think about is they really need unique content. And so what does that mean? Well, one of the easiest, or not easiest necessarily, but one of the best ways to get unique content is to do stories that you're generating yourself, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a big investigative project. It could be simply digging better on the beat. It could be, good watchdog stories, small enterprise, but it's producing things that people can't get anywhere else. And I really do believe that a lot of news organizations now are understanding that and are realizing that if they invest a little bit more in reporters who can do that, and in training and skills that will help get their staff back up to speed at that sort of thing, it can make a real difference.
Let's talk about training. IRE, that's one of the things IRE does, is train reporters and editors to be better investigators. Say a few words about some of the training and tools that are out there that people can get started with at little or no cost.
Sure. Well, and I'll talk more generally. I mean, IRE, we are a training organization. The purpose of our organization really is to provide training and resources for journalists. That's what we do. But we're not the only ones out there who do that. So speaking more generally, there are a lot of ways that you can work on getting your skills better. We have, for those who are IRE members, we have a lot of resources online and free to members that we have a huge library of tip sheets that reporters can look at. Say you're new on a beat and you have to tackle a story at City Hall. You could go online and find, all these resources that other journalists have used to find stories, dig deeper. There's our organization and others do regional training around the country. And if you keep your eye out for that sort of thing, that chances are there's a workshop or something that's going to be, if not in your town in driving distance, that's going to be pretty low cost. Most of what we do is thankfully grant underwritten, and so we can keep the costs really, really low. So for not much more than the cost of some gasoline, which isn't that cheap anymore,
but getting cheaper.
Yeah. So there are a lot of ways, if you want to, that you can immediately start to gain some of the skills that you need.
Yeah, one of the resources that I've been impressed with is a partnership that Gannett and IRE have done to deliver some training to scores and scores, hundreds of journalists over WebEx and other very inexpensive formats, highly customized, highly targeted trainings.
Right, and I would say that Gannett's really been at the forefront of the large media companies that have come to us looking for training specifically for their staff. We started, I think it was probably 3 years ago now. We did some regional watchdog workshops, is what we call them, specifically for Gannett journalists. I believe 4 of them around the country. And now we're doing a series of webinars, some more advanced, kind of following up on what we did the first time, some of them meant to be sort of introductory, and we've been able to reach, I mean, I don't really know what the numbers are, but just the in-person training alone probably reached more than 300 journalists, and then we've done this series of webinars. So it's been, what's been really heartening to us is the commitment that Gannett's made to do this, and it's not just the money the company might be spending, but I think it's also the message that the company sends when it tells its reporters that it understands that this kind of reporting is important and that we value it and that we want to provide some resources to help you do more of it. I think that sometimes is just as important as the training that you can receive.
It's the most important thing we do. And so that's where we're putting our investment. And here at the IRE conference, we've got a pretty strong presence.
Oh, yeah.
All these journalists.
Absolutely.
And full ride scholarships and things like that. But tell me a little bit about some of the best techniques in investigative journalism that you're seeing over the last 2 or 3 years with all the technologies that are available, with all the advanced search methodology, with all the training that people have at their disposal. What sorts of great new techniques are you seeing investigative reporters using now? Well,
it's really interesting because some of what's out there is brand new and people have to learn, and some of what's out there that's really being discovered or rediscovered by journalists are things that have been out there for a long time but just haven't been utilized enough. For example, we've been teaching since the early 90s what we call computer-assisted reporting, and sometimes that's as simple as learning how to use a spreadsheet for journalism purposes to do analysis. And what we have found is that with the advent of the web and the desire to start putting data online for a lot of news organizations and the ability to put interactive presentations on your site that allow your audience to interact with that data, that now a whole host of editors and news organizations that never really understood what this was for, or might have had one person in the newsroom who knew how to crunch some numbers, suddenly they all get it, because you can put the data online. If you do it in a smart way, you can draw a lot of traffic and attention to your stories. And so we're seeing that in some ways technology is taking technology that's been around for a long time and reintroducing it to a lot of people because they can interact with it in new ways. And then, of course, with all the with the apps and everything else, there's different things you can do now to sort of engage and draw on your audience. And there's more and more data that's becoming available online than there ever has been before. And so once again, journalists who have the skills and know how to deal with that data, it's much easier to go online, to find some of what you want, to download it and use it. And then just in general, knowing how to find information online, knowing how to search the web intelligently. Those are all pretty fundamental skills at this point, I would say, that every reporter needs to have just to be able to sort of provide the news they need to provide and stay competitive.
But as you point out, computer-assisted reporting predates the existence of web browsers and ubiquitous access to the internet. So now it's just not the province of the one junkie who goes down to the library all day, but it's something that has to be everybody's skill set.
Yeah, we think so. I mean, we really do. Like I said, we've been teaching this since the very early 90s, and at the time, it was mostly people who were really into data or data geeks or news organizations that wanted to get maybe one person trained up. You can't afford to do that anymore, though. No. It's become too important to have a number of people on your staff able to easily take data, manipulate it, work with it. Both because there's more data out there. There's sometimes almost, in some ways, there's too much, and in some ways, it's not. The government wants you to think that they've now made themselves completely transparent, and they have not. And so one of the keys is to be able to now look at all the data and all the information that's being thrown at you, all the PR that government agencies are now able to do on their websites so well, and to be able to cut through that and say, that's great, your analysis of your numbers is fine, but why don't you give me that data and let me take a look at it?
Sure. I want to talk about other sources of investigative reporting out there that go beyond existing news organizations that have been around for a long time, and that's the nonprofits.
Sure.
So ProPublica, there's the Center for Investigative Reporting, there's California Watch, there are all sorts of nonprofits out there. What contribution are they making to the field of investigative journalism over these last couple of years?
Right. Oh, it's been profound in a number of ways, really. It's not just, you mentioned some of the really large ones, but there are, I think the most important thing, there were a few large, there was Center for Public Integrity, Center for Investigative Reporting, been around for a long time and doing this kind of work. What you've really seen, in addition to ProPublica, as you mentioned, is at the state level and sometimes even at the local level, news organizations that didn't exist 5 years ago that are dedicated to watchdog enterprise or often investigative reporting specifically. In many cases, those are reporters who are doing that work for daily newspapers or television stations, and either decided to leave and set out on their own, or their news organizations cut back to the point that it wasn't making sense anymore. And so they've sort of started their own organizations dedicated to doing investigative journalism. What's happened in many of these cases is that the news organizations these folks used to work for now pick up their stuff and run it, you know, because the model at the moment tends to be producing content that's available to anybody and having people pick it up and use it. What's going to be interesting is to see how these organizations make the transition from largely grant-funded startups to organizations that can establish their own, you know, their legs and their ability to sustain themselves economically over a long period of time.
And that will be these next year or two one of the big stories. Well, as we're talking about costs and revenue realities that have forced some of these innovations with nonprofits, I'm thinking back to earlier in our discussion when we talked about how expensive great investigative journalism can be, but it's not necessarily that great investigative journalism has to be expensive, right?
Well, I mean, it depends on, this is what I always run into in conversations like this, is first of all, you have to define what's investigative journalism, right? Is investigative journalism the I-team and the reporter who disappears or digs in for 6 months or a year and does a great project, or the team of reporters who do that? And yeah, that's investigative reporting, and there's still some great stuff being done. USA Today just launched a fantastic project that had taken a number of people a number of months to work on, and that's vitally important. And when there are organizations like that willing to commit those sorts of resources, makes a tremendous difference. And I do think that kind of journalism, which is expensive, pays off in other ways, because when your news organization becomes known as a place that will do that kind of work, people come regularly to see what you're up to look at what you're doing. If you have hugely interactive projects like that one is, people come back repeatedly because they want to look more things up. But that's sort of the traditional big model investigative project. What we're seeing a lot of, though, and always did, frankly, are the much smaller projects that can still have a lot of impact, right? I mean, you can have a reporter who's a beat reporter, who covers City Hall, who covers the local school district, but who knows how to dig, and either they're given a little time to work on something, or they chip away at it over time, or they begin to do a series of stories that digs deeper and deeper and deeper until it creates real change, and I define that as investigative reporting as well. And that doesn't have to cost any more than having the same reporter just go sit, take notes in meetings, write profiles of people, right? There's no more cost there. It's just having the people on staff have the will, the interest, and the training to do that kind of work.
Related to all that, what would you tell a publisher or an editor who's feeling the pressure of, you know, needing to be as efficient and as productive and, you know, fill as much space as they've got, and maybe taking their eye off the ball on investigative journalism? What would you tell them in terms of the long-term value of putting their eye back on the ball? Well,
you know, there's always been that tension. Even when news organizations were staffed significantly more than they are now, you still had to justify taking somebody off of something for a period of time. There was still the concern about feeding the beast, because the beast was bigger, right? You had a bigger staff, and you had more pages, and you had a bigger news hole. So there's always been that tension. And I think that the way to look at it is, you know, you have to balance it. Everybody on your staff can't be working on nothing but enterprise all the time if you're a daily, you know, publication or a broadcast or whatever that might be. But what we find a lot of news organizations do when they have smaller staffs and they still want to do this kind of work is you pick and choose. And if you've got somebody, say, who's covering the school district and they get on something good, you might be able to free them up, move some other people around. It's all about making choices. And you may decide you can forego a couple of those daily things you were going to do because in a week or two or whatever it might take, you're going to have that story with the big pop that comes out. And there's a couple of things about that. First of all, that story often then generates its own stories, and suddenly you're filling the news, again, you're filling the news hole now, but you're filling it with stories you've generated and an agenda you've set, which is where you want to be, right? And I think also at the end of the day, you know, at the year's end, I say this a lot when I'm talking to groups of reporters or editors, it's, you know, when you think back on what you did this past year, what do you remember? Do you remember the 16 meeting stories you had to do that month or whatever? Or do you remember the 2 or 3 things you did that you really generated something that made a change, made a difference? Well, you remember that stuff, and I think that's what the audience remembers too. You know, so I think that if you have a fewer bylines, but the ones you have more impact, that's what people remember, and that's what keeps people coming back.
It's basically right out of our playbook. We're trying to have more impact with every single thing we do, and forego the turn of the wheel, incremental coverage, and use that time to do things that make more of a difference and move the needle more.
Right, but that's tough. I mean, that's one of those things that's sometimes easier to say than to pull off, because sometimes you get the better stuff by covering the incremental, right? A lot of the best investigative or enterprise journalism or watchdog coverage comes because somebody's been watching the wheel turn. I mean, that's still important. Right. And so it really is that balancing thing of figuring out how you can keep people, you know, with their finger on the pulse sufficiently and giving your audience what they need to know. And it's, you know, it's just trying to make smart choices. We got to cover that. We got to cover that. That we can let go.
Well put. But it's there's not necessarily a direct relationship between covering something and writing a story about it every time. So perhaps the answer is being present and having your finger on the pulse and developing those sources, but not necessarily having to write a story every time somebody raises their hand or says something.
Yeah, or now with the web too. I mean, if you a lot of news organizations are making really smart use of blogs to do just that. Instead of having somebody come back and do a full-fledged story, they can write something shorter, get it up there on the web, run it in the paper, or if they want to the next day. But they've covered it, they've logged it in for those who want to know, but they haven't spent all day putting together the story that really at the end of the day doesn't tell me much more than those 3 or 4 paragraphs that you could just post instantly and move on.
And you're describing just using the right tool for each job rather than the same tool for every job. So, Kate, you're here in the audience. Is there anything that while we're talking to Mark that you wanted to say or ask or bring up or have Mark speak to?
When we set out 3 years ago to say we really need to ramp up our commitment to watchdog journalism, we turned to Mark and his team, and they have met us at every step and done great programming and everything we've asked. You've just been great. So very publicly, I want to thank you.
Well, thanks.
Very good. Well, Mark, that's those are the things that I wanted to cover,
okay.
And I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have 1,000 people here at the conference that you need to get back to, and 500 of whom will expect you to have remembered their face next time you meet them. So I wish you good luck with that. But you're an inspiration to all of us, and the organization that you're leading has made such a difference for Gannett journalists and indeed journalists across the country. So please keep up the good work.
Well, thanks. And we really appreciate the opportunity we've had to work with all of you. It's been a great experience for us as well. And this is true. We've used this when we've talked to other news organizations of what you're doing, and it has been, other news organizations have adopted some of what you're doing for themselves. And I think that's had great impact as well. So we really appreciate it.
Good. That's Mark Horvit, Executive Director of Investigative Reporters and Editors.